May 8, 1945. Cologne, Germany. The cathedral towers still stood, blackened sentinels over a city reduced to rubble. Corporal Friedrich Weber pressed his back against the cool stone of a collapsed building, his left leg screaming with pain that radiated up through his spine and settled behind his eyes like hot iron. The wound, a jagged tear where shrapnel from an American artillery shell had ripped through his thigh 3 days earlier, had stopped bleeding, but now wept something clear and foul-smelling that soaked through the makeshift bandage he'd torn from his own undershirt. He was 23 years old. He had not eaten in 48 hours. And he was absolutely certain he was going to die in this pile of stones that had once been someone's home. The sound reached him first. An engine's growl, different from the diesel rumble of Wehrmacht vehicles. Higher-pitched, almost cheerful in its mechanical confidence. Then came the voices, speaking English with an accent that carried across the broken cityscape like birdsong in a graveyard. Friedrich's hand moved instinctively to where his rifle should have been. Found nothing. Remembered that he'd thrown it into the Rhine 2 days ago, along with his papers and his Iron Cross and everything else that marked him as a soldier of the Reich. A white star painted on olive-drab metal appeared around the corner of the rubble. An American jeep, moving slowly through the devastated street, picking its way around craters and collapsed facades. Friedrich tried to make himself smaller, pressed himself harder against the stone, felt the rough texture scrape against his back through his torn uniform. His breathing came fast and shallow. Every story he'd heard about American soldiers flooded back. The propaganda about Jewish commissars who tortured German prisoners, about Negro troops who knew no mercy, about the vengeful liberators who would make Germany pay in blood for every mile of Europe she had conquered. The jeep stopped. Boots hit the pavement. That distinctly American sound, different from German military boots, softer somehow. Friedrich could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears, could smell his own fear sweat mixing with the stench from his wound. This was it. This was how it ended. Not in battle, not with honor, but hiding in ruins like a rat while his leg rotted beneath him. "Hey! You there! Come out!" The English words meant nothing to Friedrich, but the tone was unmistakable. Command. Discovery. He closed his eyes, said a prayer his mother had taught him when he was 6 years old, and tried to stand. His leg buckled immediately. He went down hard on the broken stones, gasping, and when he opened his eyes again, there were 2 American soldiers standing over him, rifles pointed at his chest. For several seconds, nobody moved. Friedrich stared up at them. One with dark skin he'd been taught to consider subhuman. One with freckles and red hair spilling out from under his helmet. They stared down at him, taking in the Wehrmacht uniform, the makeshift bandage now completely soaked through with that clear, terrible fluid. The hollow cheeks and fevered eyes of a man who'd been dying by inches for days. The black soldier lowered his rifle first, said something to his companion in that rolling English that sounded almost musical. The redhead nodded, slung his rifle over his shoulder, and did something Friedrich could not process at first. He knelt down beside him, not to strike or restrain, but to examine. Gentle fingers pulled away the sodden bandage. A low whistle. More rapid English exchange. Infected, Friedrich heard, understanding that word because it sounded like the German. Bad. Then they were lifting him, and Friedrich tried to resist because this was surely the moment they would throw him against a wall or into the back of a truck, bound for some terrible camp. But his body had no resistance left to give. They carried him, actually carried him, their arms under his shoulders and knees, to the jeep, laid him across the back seat, with a care that made absolutely no sense to everything he'd been taught to expect. The engine roared to life. The jeep lurched forward, and Friedrich Weber former corporal of the Wehrmacht, began a journey that would shatter every certainty he'd ever held about the world. The field hospital sprawled across what had once been a German military barracks, now flying the stars and stripes from every building. When the jeep pulled up to the entrance, Friedrich had expected to be taken to a holding area for prisoners, expected to wait. If German military hospitals were overwhelmed and understaffed, surely American facilities for enemy wounded would be even worse. He'd heard the stories about the Russian front, about German soldiers left to die in the mud while their captors saved resources for their own. Instead, within 60 seconds of arrival, he was on a gurney. Within 3 minutes, he was inside a building that smelled of antiseptic and fresh paint. Within 5 minutes, a doctor, an actual doctor with clean hands and crisp fatigues and captain's bars on his collar, was cutting away his bandage and examining his leg with an intensity that suggested Friedrich's life actually mattered to him. "Jesus Christ," the doctor muttered in English, then looked up at Friedrich's face and said something else, something gentle. A nurse appeared with a syringe. The doctor made a gesture. "This will hurt, but then it will stop hurting," and Friedrich felt the needle slide into his arm. The morphine hit his system like warm honey spreading through his veins. The pain that had been his constant companion for 3 days began to recede, pulling back like a tide, leaving behind a strange floating sensation. He watched through the drug haze as the doctor worked, as nurses moved around him with efficient purpose, as someone, impossibly, brought over an IV stand and began hanging bags of fluid. No waiting line. No determination of whether he was worth the resources, no calculation of his value as a human being versus his status as an enemy. Just medicine, practiced with the same focused intensity whether the patient wore an American uniform or a German one. Friedrich tried to understand this, tried to make it fit into the worldview he'd carried through 6 years of war. The Americans were supposed to be soft, decadent, mongrelized, inferior. That's what he'd been told. That's what every film and radio broadcast and newspaper article had proclaimed. These were the people whose country was so weak it let Jews run their banks and newspapers, whose military was so unprofessional it let Negroes serve alongside whites, whose culture was so degraded they valued money over blood and soil. But the hands working on his leg were not the hands of inferior beings. They were skilled hands, confident hands, hands backed by education and resources and a medical system that apparently didn't distinguish between American soldiers and German prisoners when it came to saving lives. The surgery took 2 hours. Friedrich floated through most of it on a morphine cloud, occasionally surfacing to consciousness enough to register the strange clinical ballet happening around him. The precise movements of the surgical team, the quiet competence of the nurses, the hum of equipment he'd never seen before. At one point, he became aware enough to understand that they were debriding the wound, cutting away infected tissue, that without this he would have died of sepsis within days. They were saving his life. The enemy was saving his life. Without hesitation, without delay, without apparent consideration of the fact that his hands had pulled triggers that sent bullets toward American soldiers, that he'd served a regime that had brought hell to Europe and beyond. When he woke in the recovery ward, the cognitive dissonance hit him with the force of physical pain. He was in a clean bed, white sheets, a pillow. His leg was bandaged properly now, elevated, no longer throbbing with that deep infected agony. An IV line ran into his arm, delivering something clear and nourishing into his dehydrated body. Around him in other beds lay more German soldiers, some Wehrmacht, some SS, all receiving the same care, the same attention, the same resources. A nurse noticed he was awake. She was perhaps 40, with gray in her hair and tired eyes that still managed to be kind. She said something in English, received his blank stare in return, then tried again, in broken German. "Water? Thirsty?" He nodded. She brought him water in a real glass, not a tin cup or canteen, held it to his lips while he drank. The water was clean, cold, miraculous. "Your leg," she said, struggling with the German words. Will be. Okay. The doctor. He is good. Very good, she smiled. You will walk again. Friedrich felt something break inside his chest. Not his body. That was being repaired piece by careful piece. Something else. Some foundational assumption about the nature of reality, about the ordering of the world, about who deserved care and who deserved only death. The stories began to accumulate like evidence in a trial against everything he'd believed. Werner, in the bed next to him, had been captured at Remagen. Taken prisoner while trying to blow the bridge across the Rhine, had expected execution. Saboteurs were supposed to be shot on sight. Instead, the Americans had given him hot coffee and a cigarette, had treated a minor shrapnel wound in his shoulder, had processed him through their prisoner system with bureaucratic efficiency rather than vengeful fury. Klaus, 2 beds down, had been wounded in the defense of Aachen. A mine had taken his foot. He'd been certain he would die. What army would waste resources on a permanent cripple from the losing side? But the American surgeons had cleaned the wound, had fitted him with temporary prosthetics, had spoken to him through an interpreter about rehabilitation programs available at prisoner camps. Hans, across the ward, had the most incomprehensible story of all. He'd been in a Wehrmacht field hospital when American forces overran their position. The German doctors and nurses had expected to be separated from their patients, had expected the wounded to be abandoned or worse. Instead, the American Medical Corps had simply integrated themselves into the existing operation. American doctors had worked alongside German doctors. They'd shared supplies, shared knowledge, shared the burden of caring for the wounded, regardless of which uniform they wore. They brought penicillin, Hans said, his voice carrying the weight of revelation. Do you know what that means? Real antibiotics, not the ersatz garbage we'd been using. They brought it for everyone. Americans, British prisoners they were treating, Germans, everyone. Friedrich listened to these stories and felt his internal world continuing to disintegrate. Each tale was another hammer blow against the edifice of Nazi ideology he'd absorbed over the past 12 years. If the Americans were the decadent, inferior race, why were they so obviously superior in every material sense? If the German folk represented the apex of civilization, why had they been so thoroughly defeated? If the Aryan race was meant to rule, why were their conquerors treating them with more humanity than they'd ever shown to anyone they'd conquered? On his 3rd day in the American field hospital, he witnessed something that completed his transformation. A group of children appeared at the fence surrounding the hospital compound. German children, ragged and thin, with those hollow eyes that spoke of months of malnutrition. They weren't begging, exactly. They were simply there, staring in at the Americans with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. Friedrich watched from his window as an American soldier, the same red-haired private who'd found him in the rubble, walked over to the fence. The children flinched, started to back away. The soldier held up his hands in a gesture of peace, then reached into his pockets and began pulling things out. Chocolate bars, small cylinders wrapped in wax paper, Tootsie Rolls, Friedrich would learn later, chewing gum, candy from the soldiers' personal rations, the extras that American servicemen received regularly, thoughtlessly, as part of their overwhelming material abundance. The soldier didn't hand the candy through the fence with formal charity. He threw it, just tossed it over the wire, handful after handful, letting it scatter on the ground on the other side. The children scrambled for it with a hunger that went beyond mere appetite. They dove for those pieces of chocolate and candy like drowning people grasping for floating debris. Other American soldiers noticed. Within minutes, a dozen of them had congregated at the fence, all emptying their pockets, all throwing candy and chocolate and gum to the German children. They were laughing while they did it, calling out to each other in English, making it into a kind of game. For them, it was casual generosity, the thoughtless disposal of surplus that they'd been carrying around anyway. For the children, for Germany, it was revelation. Friedrich watched a little girl, no more than 7 years old, clutch a Hershey's bar to her chest like it was made of gold. Watched a boy carefully unwrap a Tootsie Roll and break it into pieces, distributing them among his smaller siblings with the solemn responsibility of someone dividing up precious resources. Watched parents standing behind the children, trying to maintain their dignity, while their eyes betrayed the same desperate hunger, the same shock at this display of casual abundance. This was what defeat looked like. Not just military defeat. That could be explained away, blamed on circumstances, rationalized as temporary setback. This was civilizational defeat. This was the moment when you realized that while your children were starving on 1,200 calories a day, while your cities were rubble and your infrastructure was destroyed, the victors had so much food that they could literally throw it away. That, what was garbage to them, pocket change, surplus rations, the stuff they didn't feel like carrying, was treasure beyond measure to you. Friedrich thought about the propaganda films he'd watched, the ones showing American soldiers as soft and undisciplined, their armies as chaotic and ineffective. He thought about the rallies where he'd been told that one German soldier was worth 10 Americans, that the democratic capitalist system produced weakness, while the National Socialist system produced strength. He thought about these lies and watched American soldiers scatter chocolate on German streets from a position of such complete material superiority that they could afford to be generous, and he felt the last pieces of his old worldview crumble into dust. The numbers told their own story once you paid attention to them, once your eyes were open to see them. The American military ration included 4,000 calories per day for each soldier. 4,000. Friedrich had done the mathematics in his head, lying in his hospital bed, because the numbers were so staggering they demanded verification. German civilians, by the war's end, were surviving on 1,500 calories daily, barely enough to prevent slow starvation. German soldiers in the field had received 2,500, maybe 3,000 on good days. But 4,000 was just the baseline for American troops. That didn't count the supplemental packages, the care packages from home, the PX supplies, the canteens where soldiers could buy additional food with their pay. The average American serviceman had access to more calories than a German general had seen in the last year of the war. The chocolate alone was staggering. By 1945, the Hershey Company had produced over 3 billion rations bars, 3 billion, specifically for the military. The Field Ration D, a specialized chocolate bar, engineered not to melt in tropical heat, had been mass-produced since 1943. Each bar contained 600 calories and was designed to be so hard it had to be shaved with a knife, specifically so soldiers wouldn't eat it casually and would save it for emergencies. The Americans had so much chocolate they'd literally engineered it to be unpleasant, to discourage consumption. And their soldiers threw it away anyway, into the streets of conquered cities, because they had more where that came from. Friedrich learned these details from an interpreter, a German-American soldier named Schmidt, who'd volunteered to work with the wounded prisoners. Schmidt had grown up in Milwaukee, had German parents, spoke both languages fluently. He seemed almost apologetic as he explained the scale of American production, as if he understood how devastating these numbers would be to men raised on propaganda about Aryan superiority. The United States, Schmidt told Friedrich one afternoon, produced more war material in 1944 alone than Germany, Japan, and Italy combined produced during the entire war. Tanks, planes, ships, vehicles, ammunition, food, everything. My country built a Liberty ship, a 10,000-ton cargo vessel, every 4.5 days on average. Built them from scratch, launched them, and sent them across the Atlantic faster than German U-boats could sink them. Friedrich tried to process this. 4.5 days to build a ship that would have taken German yards months, every 4.5 days, for years. The Willow Run factory in Michigan, Schmidt continued, and Friedrich could hear something in his voice. Not exactly pride, but a kind of awed respect for the sheer scale of industrial capacity. Produced one B-24 bomber every 63 minutes at peak production. One complete heavy bomber, ready to fly, every hour. The factory employed 42,000 people and had its own highway and rail system just to move parts around inside. One bomber every hour. Friedrich thought about the desperate, late-war German efforts, the improvised production in caves and forests, the ersatz materials and slave labor that had characterized the Reich's final industrial spasms. He thought about the shortage of everything, fuel, ammunition, food, medicine, hope, that had defined his last 2 years in uniform. "We weren't fighting a country," Friedrich said slowly, understanding clicking into place like a bolt sliding home. "We were fighting a factory, an entire continent turned into one vast machine for producing military power." Schmidt nodded. "And the thing is, the military production was just part of it. While building all those tanks and planes and ships, American civilians still had more consumer goods available than Germans had before the war even started. We had rationing, sure, but nothing like what you experienced. Coffee and sugar were limited, butter was scarce, but nobody starved. Nobody even came close to starving. The mobilization for war barely touched civilian living standards." This was the detail that broke something fundamental in Friedrich's understanding. The Americans had fought a total war on 3 continents, Europe, Africa, Asia, had supported allies with massive aid programs, had fed and equipped Free French forces and Polish armies in exile and resistance movements from Norway to Greece, had sent billions of dollars in material to the Soviet Union alone, and their own civilians had still lived better than German civilians in peacetime. "I remember 1938, Friedrich said quietly. "We still had rationing then. Butter cards, meat cards. They told us it was temporary, that once we'd secured our resources, once we'd expanded the Reich's productive capacity, everyone would live better. Every year more rationing, more restrictions, more sacrifices for the final victory that was always just around the corner." "The chocolate," Schmidt said, and Friedrich heard compassion in his voice. "The candy those soldiers are throwing to children. That's not even from special shipments. That's just what every American soldier carries in his standard ration. Chocolate has been part of our field ration since 1937. Every soldier, every day for 8 years of every American soldier carrying chocolate as standard equipment, while German children forgot what sweets tasted like." Friedrich closed his eyes and saw again that little girl clutching her Hershey's bar, saw the parents standing behind their children with that look of hollowed-out dignity, saw the American soldiers laughing as they threw away what German families would have considered a feast. The letters started arriving in the 3rd week of Friedrich's recovery. Not letters to him. He was a prisoner of war, after all, and the postal system for German POWs was still being established. These were letters the American soldiers received, packages from home that they sometimes shared with the German patients. A private, named Johnson, who'd taken to visiting the recovery ward in his off hours to practice the German he'd studied in college, brought Friedrich a magazine from one of his care packages. Life magazine, dated March 1945, with color photographs that seemed to come from a different universe than the gray, ruined world Friedrich inhabited. The magazine showed American life continuing, thriving even, while the war raged. There were advertisements for refrigerators and automobiles, though the ads noted these weren't currently available due to war production. There were photos of Hollywood stars at nightclub openings, of baseball games drawing crowds of 40,000, of women in the latest fashions shopping on streets that weren't piles of rubble. One image stopped Friedrich cold. A two-page spread showing a typical American supermarket, photographed in Technicolor glory. Shelves stacked floor to ceiling with canned goods, fresh produce in bins, meat counters displaying cuts of beef and pork that Friedrich hadn't seen since before the war started. The caption explained this was an average grocery store in Omaha, Nebraska, a city Friedrich had never heard of, in the middle of the continent, nowhere near any coast or industrial center. "How is this possible?" Friedrich asked Johnson, pointing at the photograph. "Your country is fighting wars on both sides of the planet. You're producing millions of tons of weapons and equipment. You're feeding Allied armies across Europe. And your civilians still have this." Johnson looked at the photograph with the casual familiarity of someone who'd grown up with such abundance he barely noticed it. "That's just how it is back home," he said with a shrug. "I mean, yeah, we have rationing. Can't get all the sugar we want. Meat is limited to a couple of pounds a week, but nobody's going hungry. The stores always have something, a couple of pounds of meat, per week, per person, as a limitation, as rationing." Friedrich did the mathematics again. At the height of German power, before the war turned, civilians in Berlin had been allocated 400 grams of meat per week, less than a pound. By 1944, it was down to 150 grams. By 1945, meat was a distant memory for most Germans, a luxury available only through black market connections, and the Americans called 2 pounds per week, per person rationing, called it a sacrifice, called it evidence of their commitment to the war effort. "My mother's church," Johnson continued, warming to his subject, "runs a program where they send care packages to soldiers, not government supplies, private packages that families put together from their own resources. She sends me cookies, coffee, chocolate, cigarettes, magazines. Every month, it costs her maybe $5 or $6, which is half a day's wages for my father, who works in a machine shop. But she does it anyway because they still have enough." Friedrich thought about his own mother, back in Dusseldorf if she was still alive. Thought about her, carefully measuring out the week's ration of bread, making it stretch across 7 days, mixing sawdust into flour to extend it, boiling potato peels to extract every last bit of nutrition. Thought about the Steck-Reuben winter of 1916, the turnip winter his grandparents had survived during the last war, when Germans had been reduced to eating cattle fodder because there was nothing else. Thought about how history seemed to be repeating itself, how once again Germany was starving while its enemies lived in abundance. "We used to say," Friedrich told Johnson, choosing his words carefully, "that Americans were soft, decadent, that your prosperity made you weak, that you couldn't sustain a long war, because you weren't willing to make real sacrifices, that when things got hard, you'd quit." Johnson smiled, but there was no mockery in it. "I've heard that from other German prisoners. They seem pretty surprised to find out we're still here." "More than still here," Friedrich said. "You're everywhere. Your planes own the skies. Your tanks control the roads. Your ships dominate the oceans, and you did it while your civilians still had supermarkets full of food." He shook his head, trying to reconcile this reality with everything he'd been taught. "We were told the opposite was true. That hardship made nations strong. That sacrifice and discipline produced military power. That our willingness to endure anything would make us unstoppable." "Maybe," Johnson said thoughtfully. "It's not about how much people are willing to suffer. Maybe it's about how much a country can produce. You can't win a modern war on willpower alone. You need steel and oil and food and industrial capacity. And it turns out a country where people are prosperous and well-fed can produce a lot more of that stuff than a country where everyone's starving." It was such a simple observation, but it inverted everything Friedrich had been taught about the nature of national strength. The Nazi ideology had glorified sacrifice, had celebrated hardship, had turned suffering into a virtue that supposedly forged superior men. And here was this young American private casually explaining that prosperity was the actual foundation of military power, that abundance produced victory, that keeping your people well-fed and your economy productive was more important than ideological purity or willingness to endure. In his 4th week of recovery, Friedrich was moved to a prisoner of war processing camp. His leg had healed enough to walk with crutches, though the doctors cautioned him against putting too much weight on it too soon. The field hospital had done its job. He would live, would walk normally again with time and rehabilitation. The POW camp was situated in what had been a German military training facility, now converted to house the flood of prisoners captured in the final weeks of the war. Thousands of German soldiers, from teenagers barely old enough to shave to grizzled veterans of the Eastern Front, all gathered together in the strange limbo of captivity. The conditions were basic but adequate. Tents in neat rows, latrines that actually worked, clean water, and, most remarkably, regular food. The American Guards distributed rations twice daily, and while the portions weren't generous, they were consistent and sufficient. No one was starving. No one was being abused. The treatment was correct, professional, almost bureaucratic in its efficiency. What Friedrich noticed most was the contrast between the American abundance and German destitution. The guards' waste bins overflowed with discarded food, bread crusts, half-eaten sandwiches, fruit that wasn't quite ripe enough, coffee that had gone cold. This casual disposal of edible food, in full view of prisoners who'd been hungry for years, was its own form of psychological warfare, not intentional cruelty. The guards weren't trying to taunt their prisoners. It was simply that their standard of living was so high they could afford to throw away what would have been treasure to the defeated Germans. The Red Cross packages arrived in the 2nd week. Friedrich stood in line with hundreds of other prisoners, watching as American soldiers unloaded crates stamped with the Red Cross insignia. Each prisoner received one package, a cardboard box about the size of a bread loaf, packed with items that seemed to come from some fairy tale version of reality. Friedrich carried his package back to his tent before opening it, wanting privacy for what felt like an almost sacred ritual. Inside, 2 cans of corned beef, 1 can of salmon, a package of crackers, 4 chocolate bars, a small tin of butter, powdered milk, cheese, sugar cubes, instant coffee, and a pack of cigarettes. He stared at this treasure for several long minutes, trying to calculate the caloric value, the nutritional content, the sheer impossible luxury of it all. This was a week's worth of food for a German civilian, maybe more. It was his, given freely, distributed by the same organization that operated internationally, that worked with all sides, that existed to ameliorate suffering regardless of nationality or ideology. Around him, other prisoners were opening their packages, and the sounds were remarkable. Gasps, prayers, quiet weeping. Men who'd survived Stalingrad and Normandy, who'd endured years of combat, sat on their cots and cried at the sight of a chocolate bar. Friedrich opened the corned beef first. The can had a key attached to the bottom that you turned to peel back the metal lid. A small mechanical marvel in itself. The smell that emerged made his mouth water instantly. Real meat, preserved in fat, dense with protein. He ate it slowly, forcing himself to savor each bite, aware that he should probably ration it out over several days, but unable to stop himself. The chocolate came next. American chocolate, different from the European varieties he remembered from childhood. Sweeter, with a slightly grainy texture, but extraordinary nonetheless. He let it melt on his tongue, closed his eyes, and remembered being 8 years old, before the Nazis, before the war, when his father had brought home chocolate from a business trip to Switzerland. That night, someone in the tent started singing. An old folk song, not a Nazi march or propaganda hymn, but something from the deep German past, about forests and streams and peaceful villages. Others joined in, voices rough with emotion and malnutrition, singing in the darkness about a Germany that might have existed once, that might exist again someday, that had nothing to do with conquest or racial purity or thousand-year Reichs. Friedrich didn't sing. He lay on his cot, leg throbbing despite the medication, stomach fuller than it had been in months, and thought about the trajectory that had brought him here. From a middle-class family in Dusseldorf, to the Wehrmacht, to the Eastern Front, to the desperate defense of the Rhine, to a pile of rubble in Cologne, to an American field hospital, to this POW camp where the victors distributed food and medical care with bureaucratic efficiency. He thought about the propaganda he'd absorbed, the certainty he'd felt about German superiority, the conviction that the Reich represented civilization's pinnacle. He thought about watching American soldiers scatter chocolate on German streets, about supermarkets in Omaha, about industrial production that could sustain total war while maintaining civilian prosperity. He thought about how wrong he'd been, how wrong they'd all been, how the lies had been so comprehensive, so all-encompassing, that it took defeat, total, absolute, undeniable defeat, to crack the shell of ideology and reveal the truth underneath. The full scale of the transformation came in layers, like an archaeological excavation, revealing civilization beneath civilization. First came the material realization, the simple, overwhelming fact of American abundance. This was the most immediate, the easiest to process. You could see it, touch it, taste it. The chocolates scattered on streets, the Red Cross packages, the field hospitals with their inexhaustible supplies of medicine and bandages and clean sheets. This was the surface level of understanding we lost, because they had more. But deeper layers revealed themselves as the weeks passed. Friedrich talked with other prisoners, compared stories, began to piece together a larger picture. The Americans had more not because of geographical luck or temporary advantage, but because their entire system, economic, political, social, was fundamentally more productive. Democracy, which Nazi ideology had dismissed as weak and chaotic, had somehow produced greater national unity and industrial capacity than dictatorship. Capitalism, decried as Jewish manipulation and spiritual decay, had created more wealth and power than any state-controlled economy. Even deeper, the Americans had won not despite treating their soldiers well, but because of it. The Wehrmacht had operated on principles of harsh discipline, summary executions, ideological indoctrination. The U.S. Army had rotation policies, regular leave, mental health services, chaplains who actually listened to soldiers' problems. And the American system had produced more effective fighting units, better morale, higher motivation. The connection between human dignity and military effectiveness wasn't what Friedrich had been taught. Deeper still, the racial theories that had underpinned the entire Nazi worldview were simply, observably, false. The black American soldier, who'd found Friedrich in the rubble, had been professional, capable, humane. The Japanese-American interpreter at the camp spoke 5 languages and had a master's degree from Berkeley. The Jewish doctors in the medical corps were brilliant physicians who saved lives without apparent regard for the religion or ideology of their patients. The mixing of races that Nazi propaganda had predicted would weaken America had instead created a dynamic, innovative society capable of extraordinary achievements, and at the deepest level, the most devastating realization, the moral bankruptcy of everything the Reich had stood for. Friedrich began to hear stories from other prisoners, whispers at first, then more open discussions as the truth became unavoidable. Stories about camps in the East that weren't POW facilities, but something far more sinister. About systematic killings, about industrial-scale murder, about atrocities so extensive and deliberate they defied comprehension. Many prisoners refused to believe these stories at first. Friedrich himself struggled with them. It was too much, too extreme, too incompatible with the image of German culture and civilization he'd been raised with. These were rumors spread by Allied propaganda, they said. exaggerations designed to justify the harsh treatment of Germans, to make the victors feel righteous about their conquest. But the evidence accumulated. American soldiers showed prisoners photographs liberated from captured SS facilities. Survivors were brought to testify. German guards who'd worked at the camps were processed through the POW system, and their presence, their matter-of-fact acceptance of what they'd been part of, made denial impossible. Friedrich remembered a conversation with an SS officer in the processing line at the POW camp. The man had been matter-of-fact about his service, saw nothing wrong with it, explained the necessity of special treatment for racial enemies, with the same bureaucratic detachment a tax collector might use to explain filing procedures. "You don't understand," the SS officer had said. "It wasn't cruelty, it was hygiene. You exterminate vermin, not because you hate them individually, but because they're harmful to the body politic. We were doing what was necessary for the survival of the folk." Friedrich had walked away from that conversation feeling physically ill, not just because of what had been said, but because he recognized the logic. It was the same logic he'd absorbed in the Hitler Youth, the same framework that had made atrocity seem reasonable when framed in the right ideological terms. He hadn't worked in the camps, hadn't participated in the killing, but he'd accepted the premises that made such things possible. This was the final, crushing layer of realization. Complicity. He'd been part of it. Not in the sense of direct participation, but in the sense of accepting, believing, enabling. He'd worn the uniform and had taken the oath, had fought for the regime, even after he'd begun to have doubts. His silence had been consent. His service had been support. And now, he stood in an American POW camp, eating American rations, treated with American medical care, watched over by guards who somehow managed to maintain discipline without brutality, and he understood that everything he'd fought for had been not just mistaken, but monstrous. The re-education programs began in June. The Americans brought in newspapers, showed films, held mandatory sessions where prisoners were confronted with evidence of what their country had done. Some prisoners raged against this, called it propaganda, refused to watch. Others sat in stunned silence, watching footage from Bergen-Belsen and Dachau, seeing the skeletal survivors and mass graves and bureaucratic machinery of industrialized death. Friedrich watched, made himself watch, because he understood now that this was necessary, that the comfortable lies he'd lived in had to be demolished completely before anything new could be built. The films showed American and British soldiers liberating the camps, their faces registering shock and horror as they encountered conditions that defied belief. These weren't propaganda actors, but real servicemen, caught by cameras in moments of genuine emotional response to something they'd never imagined possible in a supposedly civilized nation. One film showed a town in Germany where the Americans had forced local civilians to tour a nearby concentration camp to see what had been done in their name just beyond their borders. The civilians' faces showed the same progression Friedrich was experiencing: denial, then shock, then the awful realization of complicity. These were ordinary Germans, shopkeepers and housewives and teachers, people who'd heard rumors but chosen not to investigate too closely, who'd accepted the regime's explanation of resettlement and special treatment, because questioning would have been dangerous and uncomfortable. Friedrich saw himself in those faces, saw the same willful blindness, the same choice to prioritize personal safety and ideological comfort over moral inquiry. He'd known something was wrong. The signs had been there for anyone willing to look: the disappearance of Jewish neighbors, the whispered conversations that stopped when the wrong person approached, the euphemisms that papered over uncomfortable realities. But he'd chosen not to look too closely, had chosen to believe the lies because the truth was too terrible to contemplate, because questioning would have endangered him and his family, because it was easier to accept the worldview he'd been taught than to construct a new one from scratch. This realization of moral cowardice dressed up as patriotic duty was in some ways more painful than the physical wound that had brought him to American hands. The leg wound would heal. This psychological injury would last forever. In group discussions, prisoners argued about responsibility. Many insisted they were just soldiers, following orders, doing their duty. They hadn't known about the camps. They hadn't participated in atrocities. They were innocent. Friedrich found he couldn't make that argument anymore. Not after the chocolate on the streets, not after the contrast between American abundance and German starvation, not after understanding the systematic dehumanization that had made genocide possible. The regime he'd served had been fundamentally evil, and his service, even his unwitting, reluctant service, had supported that evil. We were taught to obey, one prisoner argued during a discussion session, to trust our leaders, to believe in our country's greatness. How could we have known? But we did know, Friedrich heard himself saying. Maybe not all the details, maybe not the full extent, but we knew enough. We knew the Jews were being taken away. We knew the conquered territories were being brutalized. We knew our leaders preached racial superiority and contempt for other peoples. We knew, and we chose not to question it because questioning was dangerous and believing was easy. The room fell silent. Several prisoners glared at him. He was breaking the implicit agreement to maintain collective innocence, to preserve the fiction that they'd all been helpless cogs in a machine beyond their control, but others nodded slowly. Men who'd reached the same painful conclusion, who'd stopped making excuses and started accepting responsibility. The first step in rehabilitation, in becoming something other than defeated soldiers clinging to a discredited ideology, was this acknowledgement. We were wrong. We supported evil. We must ensure it never happens again. In August, Friedrich received his first letter from home. The Red Cross had established a mail system for POWs, and his mother had finally learned where he was and that he was alive. The letter was brief, written on paper so thin it was nearly translucent, but the words struck Friedrich like hammer blows. His father was dead, killed in an Allied bombing raid in February. Their house was destroyed. His mother and younger sister were living in the ruins with 7 other families, sharing what had been the basement of an apartment building. Food was scarce. The occupation authorities were maintaining order, but offering little help with reconstruction. His sister had joined a work crew, clearing rubble from the streets in exchange for extra rations. His mother wrote with the careful neutrality of someone who knew her letters might be censored, but Friedrich could read between the lines. She was glad the war was over. Glad he was alive. Glad even that he was in American hands rather than Russian or French. She'd heard stories about the treatment of German POWs, and American captivity seemed the least harsh option. She didn't ask about his political views, didn't mention the Nazi Party or the regime. That careful silence spoke volumes about what had become unspeakable in Germany, about the collective desire to forget and move on, to pretend the past 12 years had been an aberration, rather than something the nation had embraced with genuine enthusiasm. Friedrich wrote back, his letter equally careful, equally neutral. Told her about his injury and recovery, assured her he was being treated well, asked about her health and his sister's. Made no mention of his transformation of thought, his growing understanding of what they'd all been part of. Some things couldn't be written in a letter, couldn't be shared across the distance between a POW camp and a ruined city. But he thought about his family constantly, about his father, who'd been a minor Nazi Party official, who genuinely believed in the racial theories and the promise of German greatness, about his mother, who'd joined Nazi women's organizations, not out of ideological fervor but because it was socially expected, because refusing would have marked the family as unreliable. About his sister, who'd been 8 years old when Hitler came to power and knew no other system, who'd grown up in the League of German girls learning about racial hygiene and maternal duty and the glory of sacrifice for the fatherland. What would happen to them now? How did a nation recover from such comprehensive moral failure? How did individuals rebuild their understanding of the world when every foundation they'd relied on turned out to be rotten? Friedrich didn't have answers. He only knew that the chocolate scattered on German streets by American soldiers represented more than material abundance. It represented a different way of organizing society, a different relationship between government and people, a different set of values that somehow produced both prosperity and military power, both individual freedom and collective strength. The Americans weren't perfect. Friedrich had heard enough conversations between guards, had seen enough to understand that America had its own problems, its own injustices, its own moral failures. But they'd been right about the fundamentals in ways Nazi Germany had been catastrophically wrong. And, learning to accept that, learning to abandon the comfortable certainties of his youth, learning to reconstruct his worldview from scratch, that was the real work of captivity. Friedrich Weber was released from American custody in October 1946, processed through the de-nazification program, with a classification as a follower rather than an active party member. He returned to Düsseldorf with a slight limp in his left leg, the only physical remnant of his wound, and found a city still in ruins, its population still hungry, its future still uncertain. He found work with the occupation authorities, translating documents, helping with administrative tasks, making himself useful in the vast bureaucratic effort of reconstructing Germany. The pay was modest but regular, paid in occupation scrip that could be exchanged for actual goods. He gave most of it to his mother and sister. In the evenings, he attended discussion groups organized by American cultural officers. They read newspapers, debated political philosophy, studied the workings of democratic systems. Some attendees were sincere in their desire to understand these new ideas. Others came because attendance looked good on denazification review boards. Friedrich tried to maintain an open mind, tried to genuinely grapple with concepts like separation of powers and individual rights and market economics that had been anathema under the old regime. He never forgot the chocolate on the streets, never forgot that moment of visceral, undeniable understanding that he'd been on the wrong side of history, that the ideology he'd absorbed was not just mistaken, but poisonous, that abundance, rather than sacrifice, was the foundation of real national strength. Decades later, when his own children asked him about the war, Friedrich told them about lying wounded in rubble, about the black soldier who'd saved his life, about the surgery without waiting, about Red Cross packages and field rations and the casual generosity of victors who'd had so much they could afford to be kind. "We were taught to despise them," he said, "taught they were weak and decadent and racially inferior. And then they defeated us so completely that they could drive through our cities, throwing candy to our children from a position of such overwhelming superiority that compassion was effortless. That was when I understood. We'd lost more than a war. We'd lost the argument about what makes a civilization strong." His children, growing up in the Federal Republic of Germany, in the economic miracle of the 1950s and 60s, in a democratic society integrated into the Western Alliance, couldn't quite comprehend what their father was describing. The poverty, the hunger, the ideological certainty that had been shattered by reality. It was history to them, as distant as the Napoleonic Wars. But Friedrich remembered the taste of American chocolate on his tongue, the clean sheets of a field hospital, the faces of children scrambling for scattered candy. Remembered the long, painful process of dismantling false certainties and building something more honest in their place. The wound in his leg ached sometimes, particularly in cold weather. The wound in his worldview, never quite healed, but that was appropriate. Some injuries shouldn't heal completely. Some scars should remain visible, should serve as permanent reminders of how wrong you can be when you accept comfortable lies instead of uncomfortable truths. The Americans had scattered chocolate on German streets, and Germans had been shocked, not just by the abundance, though that was shocking enough, but by what that abundance represented, a complete inversion of everything they'd been taught about strength and weakness, about who deserved to rule and who deserved to serve. That shock, that moment of forced recognition, had been more effective than any occupation policy or re-education program. You couldn't argue with chocolate bars thrown from jeeps. You couldn't rationalize away the material reality of your defeat. You could only accept it, internalize it, and try to build something better from the ruins. Friedrich Weber died in 1993, living just long enough to see the reunification of Germany, to see the final end of the division that had followed from the war he'd fought in. His last words to his grandson, who was studying history at university, were about the importance of questioning authority, of maintaining skeptical distance from ideology, of remembering that certainty was dangerous and doubt was necessary for moral clarity. "They threw chocolate on our streets," he said, his voice weak but still carrying conviction. "And we understood, finally, what it meant to have been wrong about everything that mattered."